Ethan Nadelmann, live in the United States. I've been involved in the movement to really roll back the war on drugs for most of my adult life. It began relevant to this subject back in the 1980s when I was in graduate school and uh, and decided to write my dissertation on the internationalization of crime and law enforcement. So for that purpose, I landed up getting a security clearance, working in the State Department's Narcotics Bureau, writing a classified report on drug-related money laundering, but also traveling to 19 different countries throughout Latin America and Europe, interviewing DEA and Customs and FBI and foreign drug enforcement agents and prosecutors and some people in intelligence, probably about 200 people all told, and then writing a book called Cops Across Borders, the subtitle of which was The Internationalization of Criminal Law Enforcement. And a chapter of that book, which I had published as an article before, was called The DEA in Latin America, Dealing with Institutionalized Corruption. So this goes back almost 40 years now. And I think basically what I wrote then remains true, except perhaps the magnitude has become that much greater. But I did a lot of hard thinking about corruption, about political corruption, about criminal justice systems corruption, about varying degrees and nuances of corruption. And I think the unique contribution I made in that article and book back in the day was really talking about how an agency like the DEA, one of the world's first global police agencies, how they deal not just with foreign law enforcement systems, which was the subject of another chapter focused on Europe, but also how they deal with corruption. When you have when you're trying to work with local police agencies and you know that the agency is corrupt to the top or that corruption is woven throughout, when you have to make fundamental choices. So I'm happy to talk about, not just the impact of corruption, but how, in fact, the DEA back in the day, and I imagine it hasn't changed all that much, really tried to deal with this. I think everybody's aware of it, first of all. I mean, it just almost goes without saying. Now, there may be an under awareness of it in places like Europe and the United States, because we know that this corruption exists. We know it has affected all of the major federal and many state and local police agencies in the US. The same thing happens in Europe and other parts of the world. We just know that in parts of the world that have less developed economies, in Latin America, Africa, Caribbean, parts of Asia, that the magnitude of it, the scope of it relative to ordinary, people's ordinary lives, relative to, what legal business people are making, that it's just of an entirely another magnitude. I think the second thing is it's pretty difficult to, if not impossible, to disentangle the element of corruption from the angle of intimidation and fear and threat. The famous phrase, I think, attributed oftentimes to Pablo Escobar, about take the silver or the lead, or la plata o lo plomo, or something. I can't remember the exact words. But it was more or less, for many people working in government, whether it was in policing or prosecution or in other government positions, it was here's what we'll give you to do what we want. And if you don't take the money, well, then we will hurt you or your family or something like that. And I think, it's, we can always condemn corruption and officials for being corrupt, especially when they're in high levels and places of trust. But the fact of the matter is, oftentimes those are the two sides of the coin. It's the corruption combined with the threat of harm to the person if they don't accept the corruption. And then you have all the varying levels of corruption filtering down through different agencies. I mean, Jason, I'll tell you one story. I remember when I was interviewing the DEA guys in Latin America, and one of them told me very frankly, we have two candidates here to become the head of the narcotics agency. And the DEA locals knew that one of the guys was squeaky clean, but would just be ineffective. He did not know how to get shit done. And the other one they knew would be corrupt. But they knew they could work with him. And they knew that even though he would have been corrected by that organization and that one, they could work with him to target those organizations. And so they actually opted for the one who they knew to be corrupt because they knew they could actually advance the ball further with a corrupt but effective, a police chief, narcotics chief, than they could with somebody who was squeaky clean but couldn't get things done. Um, I mean, it's really fascinating. I remember also interviewing the DA guys. Yeah, I remember one of the guy in Ecuador, I think he had joined the gun club, like in Guayaquil, right, just as a way to network. And he knew in that gun club was the elite. It included people from the law enforcement agencies, but also from business. And he knew there were just understandings that happened there, right? Sometimes the corruption is when you have um, people who are primarily involved in legal business, but they need dollars. And one thing the narcos have a lot of is dollars, and they're willing to, give those. They need to launder that money. So therefore, making the deal with mostly legal business people to provide the dollars, and they're laundering their money, and the mostly legal business people are enabled to build their hotel business or their construction business or what have you. Local extortion. I mean, that is highly destructive to local economies, to local societies, when ordinary store owners have to worry about that. Or I remember being in Guatemala and being told back about 12 years ago and being told that basically the criminal organizations had essentially were becoming increasingly dominant players in both the construction industry and the cattle industry because they just had the capital to move into other. I mean, what do narcos do with their money? They invest that money in other businesses, both illegal and legal, right? And sometimes when they invest in the legal businesses, they're then beginning to bring some of their tactics into that business. So they may start to rely on threats and coercion in the same way they did in the drug thing. So it's more broadly corrupting in that way. These two enterprises, each one getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And one was the narco organizations, and the other one was the narcotics enforcement organizations. And they were actually playing off of one another. The bigger that one got, the bigger the other got. The bigger the other got, the bigger the other one got. So the gangs would get bigger, and the cops would get more money, and they would get bigger and hire more people. And then in the United States and some other countries, you have civil asset forfeiture, where the police agencies can seize property and money, and can keep it for their own agencies without having to prove that somebody actually did something criminal, right? I mean, it's a gross distortion of fundamental notions of, innocent until proven guilty, et cetera, right, in the US law and elsewhere. And so they just fed off of one another. So the notion that the answer lies in pouring more money into enforcement is just, that's basically a joke. And pouring money into specialized agencies, as I say, helps around the edges, can help you target some of the bad guys, but they're just going to be replaced by other bad guys. Right. So, if you really want to pour money into it, it's got to be into the quote unquote reducing demand, but not reducing demand in the way we've typically defined the US, which is, just say no type policies and drug testing and forced abstinence. It would be by competing with the illicit market by providing legal sources of the drugs that people are buying illegally. Right. I mean, one of the core ideas of more kind of envelope pushing harm reduction, right? And to some extent, the $64,000 question of the broader drug legalization debate is, what is the most effective way to allow those people who are determined to use drugs no matter what, who are going to use them whether they're illegal or legal, what is the most effective way to allow the people who are determined to use illegal drugs to get them from a legal regulated source that undercuts the illicit market, reduces the risks of those drugs, the adulterants and impurities and unknown potency, what have you. What's the best way to do that without endangering the broader population, right? Back when I was a graduate student at Harvard back in the mid 1980s, and I organized something called the Harvard Study Group on Organized Crime. And I had, a famous sociologist, Alessandro Pizzorno from Italy, who was at Harvard. And it was, people in the law school, Phil Hyman and Mark Moore in the Kennedy School, who were two of my dissertation advisors. And because it was Harvard, we were able to get very high level people to show up. I ended up having, heads of, number twos or threes of the FBI, things like that. But what I rose to remember was a guy named Ron Goldstock, who headed up, I think, the New York State Organized Crime Commission back in those days. And he was asked about anti corruption techniques. And he said, I'll tell you something. The most important things you can do, and he wasn't talking about drugs in this case. I think he was looking at union corruption, the docks, and all this sort of stuff, where there has been a major cleanup over the last 40, 50 years in the United States. He says a lot of it has to do with changing the rules of the game so that they afford less opportunities for those people who want to engage in corruption or intimidation. So he said, simply changing, for example, the rules of elections for unions, simply changing the ways that people are compensated, simply there's changing the kind of simple regulatory things so that there were fewer of the crevices that corrupt opportunities could emerge. And that plays a role in the construction industry and in dealing with unions and a whole range of other regulated industries where you can reduce criminal opportunities. When it comes to illicit drugs, it's not a regulated industry, right? It's an unregulated industry. People make the mistake of assuming that the ultimate form of regulation is prohibition, when in fact prohibition represents the abdication of regulation. It means that whatever the government's not effectively able to suppress is essentially popping up unregulated or being de facto regulated by the criminal operators, right? So in the case of drugs, it really has to do with you know, the major way to reduce those opportunities, you don't have the same way of, tinkering with regulatory rules. It has to be more fundamental changes. Well, I think we have to keep asking ourselves the question. Um, and especially when you look at a country, I mean, look, Colombia made substantial progress, although it's got a long way to go from the days of, the 1980s of, Pablo Escobar and Carlos Lede up to, more recently. Um, but they did, they showed that there were ways in which you could move forward. There were points where Peru moved forward in substantial ways. I think Bolivia under Evo Morales in its earlier years, and especially when the economy was booming, probably did well. Um, so there are moments when countries can actually make some progress under the proper leadership and when they kind of put things in perspective. When you look at a place like Mexico, which has its proximity to the U.S., which is the single greatest advantage it has in terms of, being the major drug supplier for the U.S., both as a transit country and as a producer and exporter. Um, but where the corruption is more extensive, and a country with a huge, massive legal economy as well, but where this corruption is and intimidation is just debilitating. And nobody's figured out a good answer of what exactly you do with that. And especially when the criminal organizations have access to, are able to employ violence and intimidation at such massive levels. Because that's uh, when criminal organizations can intimidate governors and federal ministers, and we don't know for sure, but maybe even federal presidents, then you're talking about a level of deterioration of the state and of respect for law and order and basic values that is fundamentally debilitating. And maybe countries learn to live with it in some way, to tolerate some level. Um, but that's the thing that needs to be solved on some level.